A library is more than a building full of books. It is a vault for entire worlds. For centuries, the greatest threat to these worlds was not time, but fire and steel. This is the story of the forgotten libraries destroyed in medieval conflicts and the irreplaceable knowledge they contained. We often picture the loss of a library as the collapse of shelves and stone, but the real erasure is far deeper. It is the silencing of ancient philosophies, the vanishing of scientific breakthroughs, and the fading of literary voices that once shaped civilizations. These repositories held the accumulated wisdom of both the distant past and their own vibrant present. Their destruction did not just burn parchment. It burned bridges to whole dimensions of human thought, creating gaps in our collective memory that can never truly be filled. By the end of this journey, you will understand the specific conflicts that consumed these knowledge centers and the haunting fragments of what we know was lost. We will explore why a river reportedly ran black with ink and how a single military campaign could end a 1,000-year scholarly tradition. What does a society truly lose when its memory is deliberately erased? To understand the scale of this loss, we must first see these places as they truly were. A medieval library was not a public institution with rows of identical books. It was a living nerve center of knowledge, often housed within a monastery's scriptorium, where monks meticulously copied texts by hand under the light of a single window. It could be the archive of a great cathedral safeguarding charters, theological commentaries, and chronicles of the realm. In royal palaces or the homes of wealthy scholars, private collections held precious volumes on astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, each manuscript a unique artifact crafted over months or even years. These repositories were not passive storehouses. They were active workshops of preservation and study, where the wisdom of antiquity was painstakingly transcribed, translated, and debated. A single codex might contain the only known copy of an ancient Greek text, a groundbreaking medical treatise, or a poet's life work. This concentration of unique knowledge, however, created a profound vulnerability. These libraries were anchored in the very places most likely to be targeted during upheaval: the wealthy heart of a city, the sanctified grounds of a major abbey, or the seat of royal power. When conflict arrived, it did not distinguish between a soldier's barracks and a scribe's desk. The destruction was often total, and with it vanished voices that had survived for centuries only to fall silent in a single, fiery moment. Fire was the most common agent of this erasure, but it was rarely an accident. In the heat of a siege, a library's wooden shelves and dry parchment offered perfect fuel for a conflagration started by catapult fire or a soldier's torch. Yet the flames often followed a conscious decision. Conquerors understood that to subdue a people, you could target their identity, and nothing held that identity more completely than their written word. Texts deemed heretical or pagan were systematically sought out and burned in public demonstrations of ideological control, a practice meant to rewrite history itself by erasing the evidence of competing beliefs. The physical destruction was sometimes a secondary effect of a broader strategy to break a city's spirit and erase its cultural memory. Beyond deliberate burning, the chaos of warfare led to a more insidious form of loss: dispersal. Victorious soldiers, seeing value not in the words but in the material, would loot libraries for their precious bindings, metal clasps, and even the parchment itself. Parchment was a valuable commodity, often scraped clean and reused or cut up for patches, book covers, or other mundane purposes. A single philosophical treatise could end its life as a shoe repair in a soldier's kit. This scattering meant that even if a text survived the initial flames, it was fragmented, its contents lost as pages were separated across continents, their original context forever blurred. Perhaps the quietest killer of all was neglect. When a monastery was dissolved, a royal court overthrown, or a scholarly institution abandoned due to shifting political winds, its library did not always meet a dramatic end. Instead, it faced a slow decay. Without patrons or protectors, books were left in damp cellars or unheated rooms where mold, insects, and the simple passage of time did their work. The knowledge within faded as the ink corroded and the pages crumbled to dust, a victim not of malice but of indifference. This framework of fire, theft, and decay sets the stage for the specific, heartbreaking stories of loss that define this hidden chapter of history. The shadow of Alexandria's loss stretches long over the medieval world, a ghost in the collective memory of every scholar who ever feared for their books. While the legendary Great Library's fate is a tangled story of gradual decline, another library in that same city met a far more definitive and symbolic end. This was the library of the Serapeum, the temple dedicated to the god Serapis. By the 4th century, this temple complex was one of the last great strongholds of pagan learning and culture in a Roman Empire that was becoming decisively Christian. Its library was rumored to house a priceless overflow of texts from the original Great Library, a surviving ark of ancient wisdom. For a time, it seemed this knowledge might endure, a bridge between the classical past and an uncertain future. But that bridge was about to be burned. The end came not from a foreign invasion, but from internal, ideological conflict. In the late 4th century, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of decrees outlawing pagan rituals and ordering the closing of temples. In Alexandria, a city famed for its passionate and sometimes violent philosophical and religious debates, these decrees ignited a tinderbox. Christian crowds, encouraged by local leaders, targeted the Serapeum. They saw it not merely as a place of pagan worship, but as a fortress for a competing worldview. The magnificent temple was stormed, ancient statues were pulled down and smashed. And the library, that repository of pagan philosophy, science, and literature, was almost certainly ransacked and put to the torch. The destruction was both physical and profoundly symbolic. It was a declaration that a new orthodoxy had arrived, and the written foundations of the old world were to be erased. This event sent a shockwave through the ancient world. The Christian historian Rufinus, who recorded the event, described the burning of the library with a sense of tragic inevitability. For later medieval chroniclers, the story of Alexandria became the ultimate cautionary tale. It was a stark lesson in how quickly the accumulated knowledge of centuries could vanish when it became entangled in a clash of beliefs. The blackened ruins of the Serapeum stood as a silent, powerful monument to the fragility of human memory. Every monastic scribe who later bent over a parchment in a candlelit scriptorium, striving to preserve a fragile thread of the past, was working in that long shadow. They understood on some level that libraries were not just storehouses, they were battlegrounds, and the fate of Alexandria was a constant, haunting reminder of what could be lost when the battle turned against the written word. This deep cultural trauma set a precedent, making the deliberate targeting of knowledge a grim possibility in conflicts yet to come. Constantinople was meant to be the ark that saved the ancient world. While Alexandria burned, this new capital on the Bosporus was founded with a grand ambition to preserve and protect the legacy of Rome and Greece. At the heart of this project stood the Imperial Library, often called the Palatine Library for its location within the Great Palace Complex. Established in the 4th century, it was designed as a direct, living successor to the great libraries of antiquity. For nearly 1,000 years, it served not just as a storehouse, but as the vibrant intellectual engine of the Byzantine Empire. Scribes worked continuously in its scriptoriums, copying and recopying deteriorating papyrus scrolls onto more durable parchment codices, ensuring the survival of foundational texts. Its collections were staggering, housing tens of thousands of volumes. This was the last, best refuge for unique works of ancient Greek philosophy, Roman law, early Christian theology, and advanced scientific treatises on mathematics and medicine that had already vanished from the West. Its existence was a promise that the light of classical learning would never be extinguished, but the library's fate would mirror that of the empire itself, not ending in one dramatic inferno, but suffering a slow, agonizing erosion across centuries of relentless conflict. The first major blow fell in the year 1204, an event so shocking it is still called simply the Sack. This was not the work of an external enemy, but of fellow Christians from the West, the armies of the Fourth Crusade. Diverted from their original goal, these crusaders breached the legendary walls and unleashed 3 days of chaos upon the richest city in the world. The Palatine Library, a symbol of imperial power and orthodoxy, was a prime target. Manuscripts were looted for their jeweled covers and sold in markets. Priceless codices were burned for fuel or torn apart. Some texts were carried back to Europe as curiosities or spoils of war, a fate that at least meant a handful survived, but their systematic collection and context were shattered forever. This event was a deep, bleeding wound from which the library and the empire never fully recovered. The attrition continued with every subsequent crisis. As the empire shrank under pressure from all sides, maintaining a vast library became a lower priority than funding armies and repairing fortifications. Later sieges by Ottoman forces and others further chipped away at the collections. Manuscripts were used as diplomatic gifts to secure alliances, sold to raise emergency funds, or simply lost as parts of the palace complex fell into disrepair. By the time the final Ottoman siege began in 1453, the Great Library was a shadow of its former self. When the city finally fell, the remaining scattered collections met varied fates. Some were destroyed in the final fighting. Others were gathered by Ottoman scholars who recognized their value, preserving them but within a new cultural and linguistic context that altered their trajectory. Many simply vanished into the private collections of soldiers or were lost to neglect. The true tragedy of the Palatine Library is one of slow fading. It was not a single moment of destruction we can point to, but a millennium-long whisper growing fainter with each passing crisis. With each dispersed codex, a unique window into the ancient world was shuttered. Works by historians, playwrights, and scientists that had survived for over 1,000 years in that one place finally met their end not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet sigh of forgetting. The empire's memory was not erased but scattered to the winds, leaving us with only fragments of the magnificent whole it once guarded. While Constantinople's library faded across a millennium, another legendary center of learning met a swifter, more absolute end. In the 13th century, Baghdad was the undisputed intellectual capital of the world. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, the city had become a dazzling beacon of scholarship, drawing thinkers from across continents to a place where knowledge was not just stored but actively created. At the very heart of this golden age stood the House of Wisdom, known in Arabic as Beit al-Hikmah. This was far more than a library. It was a grand academy, a state-sponsored translation bureau, and a vibrant hub for original research. Within its walls, teams of scholars working across languages and faiths undertook one of history's most ambitious intellectual projects. They systematically sought out ancient Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac texts on philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. These works were not simply archived, they were translated, debated, annotated, and expanded upon in Arabic, which became the new universal language of science. Here, the geometry of Euclid was preserved and advanced. The medical theories of Galen were studied and critiqued. Indian numerals, which we call Arabic numerals today, were integrated into revolutionary new mathematical systems. The House of Wisdom was a living engine of synthesis where the wisdom of past civilizations was gathered, refined, and used to launch new discoveries that would later light the way for the European Renaissance. Its shelves and scriptoriums held a unique convergence of human thought, a fragile network of ideas centuries in the making, and in the year 1258, that network was violently severed. The Mongol Ilkhanate, led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, laid siege to Baghdad. The city's defenses, once formidable, were overwhelmed. What followed was not merely a military conquest but a cultural cataclysm. The siege was brutal, and the sack that followed was systematic. The Mongols targeted the very symbols of Abbasid power and civilization, and nothing symbolized that more than the House of Wisdom. Historical accounts, though varying in precise detail, paint a consistent picture of staggering loss. It is said that the invaders threw the library's entire collection into the waters of the Tigris River. So many manuscripts were cast into the current that the river reportedly ran black with the ink washing from their pages and blue from the dye of precious illuminated texts. This image, whether literal or symbolic, captures the totality of the destruction. The physical books were gone, but the deeper loss was the knowledge they uniquely held. Vast collections of original Arabic scholarship in optics, algebra, and chemistry vanished. Commentaries on Greek philosophy that existed nowhere else were erased. Astronomical charts mapping the stars with breathtaking accuracy, and medical encyclopedias detailing surgical procedures and herbal remedies were consumed by the water or fed to the flames. This was not an attack on an army but on memory itself. The Mongol strategy sought to break the spine of a culture by destroying its written identity. In a matter of days, a center of learning that had nurtured genius for centuries was reduced to legend and rubble. The black waters of the Tigris carried away more than pages. They carried one of the brightest flames of human understanding, leaving a chill of forgetting that would be felt for generations. Far to the east, another river of knowledge was about to run dry. While Baghdad's House of Wisdom was a state-sponsored powerhouse, the great library at Nalanda in ancient India represented something different, a spiritual and intellectual ecosystem that had grown organically for over 700 years. Nalanda was not just a library attached to a monastery. It was one of the world's first true residential universities, a sprawling campus with lecture halls, meditation cells, and courtyards where thousands of students and teachers from across Asia lived and learned together. At its physical and symbolic center stood Dharmaganya, a library complex so vast it was housed in 3 magnificent multi-story buildings. Their names hint at their purpose: Ratnasagara, the ocean of jewels; Ratnadadhi, the sea of jewels; and Ratnaranjaka, the jewel-adorned. These were not poetic exaggerations. The library's holdings were legendary, a deep ocean of manuscripts on palm leaves and parchment. They contained the entire canon of Buddhist philosophy and scripture, painstaking commentaries on sacred texts, and groundbreaking works on logic, epistemology, and metaphysics that formed the core of Nalanda's scholarly fame. But the collection reached far beyond theology. It included seminal texts on grammar, linguistics, medicine, astronomy, and the arts, creating a complete curriculum for the mind. For centuries, the rustle of turning pages in these libraries was the sound of a living, breathing tradition, a continuous conversation with wisdom that stretched back to the time of the Buddha himself. This conversation ended with a sudden, violent silence in the late 12th century. Historical accounts describe the arrival of an army led by Bakhtiar Khilji, a Turco-Afghan military general pushing eastward. The story, as recorded by the Persian chronicler Minhaj-i-Siraj, tells of Khilji's surprise at encountering not a fort or a treasury, but a vast university. Mistaking the library's towers for fortifications, or perhaps understanding all too well that they housed a different kind of power, his forces attacked. The great library complex of Dharmaganya was put to the torch. The scale of the collection was so immense that the fires are said to have burned for months, a slow, smoldering annihilation of centuries of accumulated thought. The physical destruction was catastrophic, but the true end came with the dispersal. Surviving monks and scholars, the guardians of this oral and written tradition, were scattered. Many are believed to have fled to Tibet, Nepal, and other parts of Southeast Asia, carrying what fragments of memory and texts they could. This exodus meant the breaking of an unbroken teaching lineage. The vibrant, debate-filled courtyards fell quiet. The scriptoriums where knowledge had been meticulously copied and expanded for generations grew cold. The destruction of Nalanda's library did more than burn buildings. It severed the main artery of a specific, highly developed scholastic tradition, a way of thinking, analyzing, and teaching that had evolved for 700 years was suddenly homeless, its central reference points turned to ash. The loss created a permanent rift in the historical record of Buddhist philosophy and early South Asian science. We are left with only echoes, references in texts that survived elsewhere, and the haunting archaeological remains of empty libraries, reminding us of the ocean of jewels that once flowed from the mines gathered there. The flames that consumed Nalanda and Baghdad cast long shadows, but the assault on knowledge was not confined to distant empires or grand capitals. It found its way to the quiet, windswept edges of the known world, to places where faith and learning had taken root in isolation. On remote islands and along rugged coastlines, monastic communities in the British Isles became unexpected guardians of a fragile legacy. In the scriptoriums of places like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Iona, monks labored by flickering candlelight, not just copying texts but creating breathtaking works of art. They produced illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, where biblical passages were woven into intricate, swirling designs of such complexity that they seemed to capture divine light itself on the page. These monasteries were more than spiritual retreats. They were the libraries and universities of their age, repositories of biblical scholarship, classical philosophy, and local history painstakingly preserved on calfskin vellum. Their relative peace, however, made them profoundly vulnerable. This vulnerability was brutally exposed beginning in the late 8th century. The Viking Age had dawned, and for these seafaring raiders, the isolated monasteries dotting the coasts were not hallowed grounds of learning, but tantalizing storehouses of wealth. They came for the easy plunder, the silver liturgical vessels, the jeweled book covers, and the ransomable inhabitants. The libraries were collateral damage in this ruthless economy. During a raid, a wooden monastery building filled with dry parchment was a fire hazard waiting for a single stray torch. Countless manuscripts, unique chronicles, and beautifully illuminated gospels were lost simply because they were in the path of destruction meant for other treasures. The famous Book of Kells itself likely owes its survival to a frantic flight, carried by monks from Iona to Ireland for safekeeping, becoming a displaced refugee of conflict. For every one that survived, 100 others vanished, their knowledge dissolving into smoke or scattered to the winds as loose pages were trampled or looted for their valuable materials. This pattern of loss, however, reached its devastating peak centuries later, not from external raiders but from within. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII of England initiated the dissolution of the monasteries, a political and religious revolution that systematically dismantled the entire monastic network. This was not a chaotic raid but a cold, bureaucratic process. Royal commissioners were sent to audit, close, and confiscate the property of every abbey and priory in the realm. The libraries, the accumulated written memory of these institutions spanning nearly 1,000 years, were now considered assets of the state, or worse, worthless relics of a discredited faith. What followed was an act of cultural destruction on an almost industrial scale. Precious manuscripts were ripped apart, their bindings melted down for the gold and jewels. Parchment leaves were sold in bulk as scrap, to be used as stiffening for book bindings, as wrapping for shop goods, or even as toilet paper. Scholars like John Leland, appointed as the king's librarian, tried desperately to salvage what they could, rescuing cartloads of books for a new royal library, but they were a single voice against a tidal wave of indifference and purposeful erasure. The vast majority of these collections were simply dispersed and destroyed. Local histories that traced the roots of villages, unique copies of Anglo-Saxon poetry, theological commentaries, and medical texts all met a mundane, ignoble end in the workshops and privies of a new era. The dissolution did not just close buildings, it severed a living link to the early intellectual and spiritual life of the British Isles. It created a silence in the historical record far deeper than any Viking raid, a calculated forgetting that makes the surviving flashes of brilliance, like the Book of Kells, seem like lonely miracles salvaged from a great flood. The ink-stained waters of the Tigris and the smoldering ruins of Nalanda were not isolated tragedies. A similar shadow fell across the sun-drenched cities of al-Andalus, where for centuries a different kind of intellectual light had burned with extraordinary brilliance. In Muslim Spain, particularly in its magnificent capital of Cordoba, libraries were not mere annexes to power, they were its crowning glory. By the 10th century, the library of Caliph al-Hakam II was said to hold over 400,000 volumes, a number that dwarfed every collection in Christian Europe combined. This was not just a repository, it was an engine of translation and innovation. Here, the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen, preserved in Arabic, met with groundbreaking commentaries by Andalusian scholars in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. The library in Toledo, famed for its translation schools, became a bustling crossroads where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side to render these Arabic texts into Latin, slowly feeding the classical heritage back into a Europe emerging from its so-called Dark Ages. These libraries were living bridges, connecting ancient Greek thought with medieval European scholarship through the vibrant medium of Arabic science and philosophy. They held not only the wisdom of the past but the dynamic, contemporary scholarship of al-Andalus itself, a unique fusion of ideas that existed nowhere else on Earth. The fate of these bridges, however, was tied to the slow, grinding centuries of the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. As city after city fell, the great libraries did not simply change hands, they faced systematic erasure. The new rulers often viewed the accumulated Arabic scholarship not as a treasure to be preserved, but as a theological and cultural threat to be neutralized. In the wake of conquest, many texts deemed heretical or ungodly were publicly burned in autos da fe, acts of faith meant to purify the reclaimed land. Other manuscripts met a more mundane, yet equally final, fate. Their precious parchment made from calfskin was a valuable material. Bookbinders would scrape the Arabic text clean from the pages, cutting the strong vellum into strips to use as binding supports or covers for new Latin texts. A profound work of philosophy or a detailed astronomical chart could end its life as the stiffening inside the cover of a church ledger, its original content forever silenced beneath a layer of glue and new leather. Many more volumes were simply abandoned in damp palace cellars or neglected mosque libraries, left to the slow, hungry work of mold and insects. This represented a catastrophic, double-layered loss. First, it destroyed unique works of Andalusian scholarship that had no copies elsewhere. Second, it severed a critical transmission line. While some texts had already been translated and thus survived in Latin, countless others had not made that journey before their source copies were destroyed or rendered illegible. The libraries of al-Andalus were not just looted, they were culturally dismantled. The policy was one of replacement, not integration. This deliberate break in the chain of custody created another profound silence in the historical record, obscuring the full scope of Arabic intellectual achievement and its role as the essential custodian of classical knowledge. The repurposed bindings in European libraries today are silent witnesses, holding within them the ghostly imprint of a scholarship that was scraped away to make room for a new narrative. The story of lost libraries is also a story of roads not taken, of intellectual currents that were diverted or dried up entirely. One such current was flowing strongly in the Kingdom of Hungary in the late 15th century, centered on a library of almost mythical reputation. The Royal Library of Buda was the personal passion of King Matthias Corvinus, a ruler who dreamed of turning his capital into a new Florence on the Danube. He spared no expense, employing a network of agents and scribes across Italy and beyond to acquire or copy the finest classical and contemporary Renaissance works. The result was a collection of perhaps 2,500 exquisitely crafted codices, many bound in velvet or leather and adorned with the king's personal emblem, the raven. This was not just a trophy collection, it was a working library of humanist thought, containing vital texts by ancient Greek and Roman authors, along with the latest Italian writings on philosophy, science, and art. It represented a deliberate effort to graft the intellectual revival of the Italian Renaissance directly onto Northern European soil, creating a vibrant new center of learning far from its Mediterranean birthplace. For a few decades, it succeeded, making Buda a beacon for scholars, but this beacon was built on a geopolitical fault line. The library's fate was sealed on a single, muddy afternoon in late August 1526. The Battle of Mohocs was a catastrophe for the Hungarian kingdom. Its army was shattered by the disciplined forces of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and King Louis II was lost in the chaotic retreat. The road to the capital, Buda, lay open. Within weeks, the Ottomans entered the city. The royal palace, and with it the legendary library, fell into their hands. What happened next was not a single act of burning, but a systematic dismantling. The collection was looted as spoils of war. Ottoman soldiers and officials, recognizing the material and intellectual value of the beautiful codices, packed them up for transport. Many of the finest volumes began a long journey to Istanbul, where they would be absorbed into the Sultan's own treasury or given as gifts to high-ranking dignitaries. This dispersal, while preserving the physical books, severed them from their original context and purpose. In Istanbul, they became exotic treasures in a different scholarly tradition. In Hungary, their absence created a void. Other parts of the collection were not so fortunate. Books were torn apart for their precious bindings or illustrations. Some were simply lost in the chaos, discarded by soldiers who saw only cumbersome loot, their pages ending up as kindling or waste. The destruction of the Royal Library of Buda was more than the loss of beautiful objects. It was the severing of a critical link. The humanist project in Northern Europe, which drew so heavily on the rediscovery of classical texts, lost one of its richest and most accessible reservoirs. A direct pipeline of Renaissance thought was cut, forcing scholars elsewhere to rely on copies of copies, or to do without entirely. The library's scattering meant that the integrated vision of King Matthias, a synthesis of classical learning and modern inquiry anchored in Central Europe, was permanently fragmented. Its potential to shape a distinct regional flowering of the Renaissance was extinguished, leaving behind only scattered pages and the lingering question of what might have grown from that fertile ground. The pattern of targeting a people's written memory did not end with the fall of medieval kingdoms. It found a grim, modern continuation in the fate of Armenian cultural heritage, a story where the destruction of libraries was a deliberate instrument of a broader tragedy. For centuries, the Armenian Apostolic Church had served as the guardian of a distinct national identity, and its monasteries, often perched on remote mountain crags or isolated islands, became fortified vaults for an extraordinary literary tradition. Within the stone walls of places like the monastery on the island of Atama in Lake Van, or the majestic Tatov monastery complex, scriptoriums buzzed with activity. Monks known as Vardapets meticulously copied and illuminated texts, creating manuscripts that were both profound works of theology and stunning artistic achievements. These libraries did not merely hold religious books, they preserved unique chronicles of Armenian history, advanced medical and astronomical treatises that blended classical knowledge with original observation, and translations of Greek and Syriac philosophy found nowhere else. Each codex was a node in a vast, interconnected network of knowledge that had survived empires. This network, however, existed in a landscape of prolonged conflict. Across the centuries, these repositories faced repeated threats, from Seljuk raids to Ottoman campaigns, each wave of violence claiming portions of the written record. But the most systematic erasure occurred in the early 20th century, during the events historians describe as the Armenian Genocide. This was not a medieval siege but a modern, bureaucratic campaign of cultural cleansing, where the destruction of libraries and manuscripts was a calculated component. As Armenian populations were subjected to forced deportation and mass hardship, their cultural anchors were methodically attacked, monasteries were looted and burned. Precious manuscripts were torn apart, used for fuel, or thrown into rivers. Private family collections, passed down for generations, were confiscated and destroyed. The goal was to erase the evidence of a millennia-old civilization, to prove that a people and their intellectual legacy had never existed. The loss was incalculable. Unique historical accounts that provided the Armenian perspective on regional events vanished. Elaborate illuminated gospels, where the Armenian alphabet itself was woven into breathtaking art, were lost forever. Scientific texts that showed an early understanding of medicine and the stars were consumed by fire. This event represents the most harrowing extension of the medieval pattern into the modern age. It underscores a chilling truth that the burning of a library is rarely just about books. It is an attempt to unmake a world, to silence a collective voice, and to ensure that future generations have no written foundation upon which to remember who they were. The scattered pages that survived, often smuggled out at great risk or hidden in cellars, are more than artifacts. They are silent witnesses to a resilience of memory that even the most targeted fire could not completely extinguish. These vanished libraries were not just buildings of brick and wood. They were the final resting places for entire worlds of thought. To understand the true cost of their destruction, we must move beyond counting bookshelves and consider the specific, irreplaceable voices that were silenced forever. Each lost manuscript represented a unique strand in the tapestry of human understanding, and when the library burned, that strand was severed, leaving a gap we can scarcely comprehend today. Consider the ancient Greek poet Sappho, hailed as the 10th muse by her contemporaries. Her lyric poetry, celebrated for its emotional depth and technical brilliance, was collected into 9 volumes in the Great Library of Alexandria. Today, we possess only fragments, a handful of complete poems and scattered lines salvaged from quotations in other works, or from scraps of papyrus used in Egyptian mummy casings. The vast majority of her work, the full 9 volumes, existed in that one repository. When the fires of conflict and time consumed the library's collections, Sappho's voice was reduced from a symphony to a faint, echoing whisper. We know she was monumental, but we can no longer hear the full scale of her music. The loss extends deep into the heart of historical record. The Roman historian Livy wrote a monumental history of Rome, 142 books spanning from its mythical origins to his own time. It was a masterwork of narrative and national identity. Perhaps only 35 of those books survive today. The rest, the overwhelming majority of his life's work, are gone. Scholars believe complete sets of Livy's history were held in libraries like the Imperial Library of Constantinople. As that collection slowly scattered and deteriorated across centuries of siege and neglect, the last complete copies of Livy's missing books likely molded away in a forgotten corner or were lost in a fire, turning vast chapters of Rome's detailed story into permanent blanks. The tragedy is not merely that we lost these stories, but that we know exactly how much we lost. We have the table of contents, the summaries, but the rich narrative itself is dust. Perhaps the most profound losses are in the realm of science, where a single destroyed text could set human understanding back by 1,000 years. The Greek astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, working in the 3rd century before the Common Era, proposed a radical model of the cosmos. He suggested the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun, and that the stars were immensely distant. His work on this heliocentric theory was documented in a book that was studied and preserved in the great libraries of the ancient world. That book has vanished, without its last copies, perhaps lost in the final dispersal of Alexandria or Constantinople. His revolutionary idea became a historical footnote instead of a continuing line of inquiry. It would take nearly 2 millennia before Copernicus, working without direct access to Aristarchus's arguments, would independently propose the same concept. The loss of that one text did not just erase a book, it may have erased a shortcut for the human mind, a path to cosmic understanding that remained overgrown and hidden for generations. Each of these examples represents a last known copy. In a world before the printing press, a manuscript was not a copy, it was the original. If the Library of Buda held the only translation of a certain Greek text in Central Europe, its looting meant that text disappeared from that region's intellectual toolkit. When the monks of Lindisfarne fled a Viking raid, the unique chronicle they left behind on their scriptorium desk was not just damaged, it was erased from history entirely. The destruction of a medieval library was therefore an act of unique finality. It was not like deleting a digital file that might exist on a backup server elsewhere. It was the equivalent of destroying the master recording, the original film reel, and all the blueprints at once. The knowledge contained within those walls often existed nowhere else on Earth. With their passing, complete schools of philosophy, detailed historical narratives, and groundbreaking scientific insights crossed a threshold from being rare to being utterly extinct. We are left forever with only the ghostly imprint of their absence, a haunting question mark where a full chapter of the human story was meant to be. But the vanished libraries held more than just the legacy of antiquity. They also contained the original, living scholarship of the medieval world itself, voices from the very time we seek to understand. When a monastic library burned, it was not only ancient Greek poetry that turned to ash. It was the unique chronicle written by a local abbot detailing the harvests, the conflicts with the local lord, and the strange weather of a specific year. It was the dense legal commentary debating a point of canon law, capturing a vibrant intellectual argument that has since fallen silent. These libraries were filled with theological debates, records of church councils, and personal letters between scholars that mapped the evolving landscape of belief and thought. They held local histories called cartularies that documented land grants, property disputes, and the founding of villages, providing the raw social and economic fabric of daily life. These works were not copies, they were the originals, often existing in a single manuscript, the sole authoritative record of a community's memory and a scholar's insight. Their destruction did not just rob us of facts, it created profound black holes in our historical understanding. Consider a regional conflict between two minor lords, recorded only in the chronicle of a monastery that sided with one family. If that monastery's library is sacked, that entire perspective vanishes. Historians are left with only the possibly biased account from the rival family's patron church, or worse, with no contemporary account at all. The event slips from documented history into the realm of speculation, its causes, its human cost, and its resolution becoming a permanent mystery. We see the shadow of these losses everywhere. The early history of many European regions is frustratingly patchy, not because nothing happened, but because the repositories that held the local records were consumed by a Viking raid, a private war, or a simple kitchen fire. A brilliant theological interpretation from a 12th century thinker might be mentioned in a later text as influential, but without the original manuscript, we cannot trace the development of his ideas or understand why they were so compelling. We are left with only the echo of his reputation, a name without a body of work. This forces historians to reconstruct the past from fragmentary and often biased secondary accounts, like trying to assemble a complex mosaic when half the tiles are missing and the remaining ones are from a different picture altogether. The loss of these original medieval works means we are often viewing the period through a distorted lens, one polished by the victors, the survivors, or simply by the random chance of what parchment endured. Each burned library didn't just erase a collection of books, it erased a unique vantage point on the human experience, leaving a silence in our collective story where there was once a rich and complicated voice. The silence left by these libraries was not merely philosophical or historical, it was profoundly practical, erasing the blueprints for human progress. Among the most devastating losses were the advanced scientific and technical manuals that contained solutions to problems societies would struggle with for centuries. These were not abstract theories but working knowledge, the applied wisdom of engineers, physicians, and alchemists. When a library burned, it wasn't just a poet's voice that vanished. It was the formula for a life-saving antidote, the schematic for a more efficient water wheel, or the precise instructions for a material that could turn the tide of war. Consider the medical compendiums of the Persian polymath al-Razi. In the 9th and 10th centuries, he authored over 200 works, compiling knowledge from Greek, Indian, and Persian sources while adding his own groundbreaking clinical observations. His texts detailed systematic diagnoses, treatments for diseases like smallpox and measles, and the uses of hundreds of medicinal compounds. Many of these works, held in libraries from Baghdad to Cordoba, were unique master copies. Their loss in conflicts like the Mongol Sack meant that entire diagnostic frameworks and herbal pharmacopoeias simply disappeared from the mainstream of medical practice. Doctors in later generations had to relearn, through painful trial and error, what al-Razi and his peers had already meticulously documented. This same pattern repeated with engineering. Persian and Arabic libraries housed intricate manuals on hydraulics, architecture, and mechanics. Texts explained the construction of sophisticated water clocks, automated devices, and complex irrigation systems that made desert cities bloom. The knowledge of how to build and, more importantly, maintain these technological marvels was often concentrated in these collections. When the institutions that curated this knowledge fell, the expertise became fragmented. A community might still have a working aqueduct, but without the manual detailing its original engineering principles, repairing it after an earthquake became a desperate guess rather than a precise restoration. This loss of applied knowledge created a technological fragility where societies could inherit the artifacts of a more advanced past, but not the full understanding required to replicate or advance them. Perhaps no single loss is more symbolic of this than the secret of Greek fire. This legendary incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine navy was a closely guarded state secret, a chemical formula passed down through a select few. While the exact recipe was never written in a public manual, the core principles of its manufacture, the distillation techniques and chemical knowledge behind it, were almost certainly documented in restricted technical archives within the Imperial Palace in Constantinople. The final fall of the city in 1453 and the scattering of its remaining archives likely carried the last vestiges of this proprietary science into oblivion. The weapon that had defended an empire for 700 years became a myth, its operational secrets lost because the library that held the underlying science was gone. The consequence of these countless quiet extinctions was a global delay. Scientific and technological progress is not a straight line. It is a collaborative conversation across time and space. A mathematical breakthrough in 9th century India, describing concepts like zero and early calculus, needed to travel through libraries and translation houses to ignite further discovery in Persia and then Europe. When a key library in that chain was destroyed, the conversation stopped. The knowledge didn't just go dormant, it often reverted to a state of non-existence for other cultures. European alchemists would spend generations trying to rediscover the chemical processes that Arabic texts had already elucidated. Engineers would puzzle over architectural problems that Byzantine manuals had already solved. This wasn't a lack of ingenuity, it was a lack of access. The collective brain of humanity had suffered a stroke, forgetting skills it once possessed. Each burned technical manual forced a civilization to reinvent a wheel it had already perfected, wasting centuries of potential momentum. The true cost of those fires was measured not in the past, but in a future that arrived much later and far more hesitantly than it might have. Beyond the grand narratives of empires and scientific formulas, the fires consumed something even more delicate: the unique voices of peoples and cultures on the margins. When a library was destroyed, it often took with it the last surviving works written in minority or vanishing languages, erasing entire branches from the family tree of human expression. These texts were not merely translations of mainstream ideas, they were the irreplaceable keys to understanding distinct worldviews. In Egypt, for instance, the great Christian libraries held countless volumes in Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language written in a script derived from Greek. These were not just religious manuscripts, but legal documents, personal letters, and literary works that captured the daily life and thought of a people navigating the transition from pharaonic to Christian identity. As political power shifted and these institutions declined, many of these unique Coptic codices were lost to neglect or repurposed, their pages scraped and rewritten in Arabic or Greek. With each lost codex, a direct linguistic link to ancient Egypt grew fainter, making it exponentially harder for scholars to reconstruct the full, living sound of that civilization's final centuries. A similar fate befell the rich Syriac literary tradition. As a dialect of Aramaic, the language spoken by Jesus, Syriac became a major vehicle for Christian scholarship across the Middle East and Asia. Syriac chroniclers produced detailed histories of events from a uniquely Eastern Christian perspective, while scholars translated Greek philosophy and science into Syriac long before these works reached Arabic or Latin. Monasteries across Mesopotamia and Persia became treasure houses for this literature. The Mongol invasions that shattered Baghdad also ravaged these smaller, lesser-known repositories. The loss was catastrophic, not just for theology, but for history. A Syriac chronicle detailing the rise of Islam from the viewpoint of a neighboring Christian community, or a medical text blending Greek and Persian knowledge, offered a priceless alternative angle on the medieval world. Its destruction meant that our understanding of those centuries became more monolithic, filtered primarily through the records of the ultimate victors. The homogenization of history is perhaps most vividly seen in the near-total loss of pre-Islamic Persian literature. The Sasanian Empire boasted a magnificent written culture with epic poetry, courtly romances, and detailed historical records composed in Middle Persian or Pahlavi. When the Arab conquest swept through Persia in the 7th century, this vast corpus faced systematic erasure. Many texts were destroyed as symbols of the old Zoroastrian faith and regal order. While some works were later translated or summarized in Arabic, the original linguistic flavor, the poetic meter, and the nuanced cultural context of the originals were often lost. The great Persian epic, the Shahnameh, written by Ferdowsi centuries later, was a monumental effort to reconstruct this lost heritage from scattered fragments and oral tales. It stands as a majestic monument, but also as a testament to the ocean of literature that did not survive the transition, leaving a permanent gap in our appreciation of one of the ancient world's great literary traditions. Even on the far western edges of Europe, unique literary voices were silenced. The monastic libraries of Ireland, Wales, and Scotland were the primary guardians of Celtic poetry and sagas. These were not primitive folk tales, but sophisticated compositions with complex meter and deep mythological roots, recording laws, genealogies, and a world intimately tied to the landscape. The Viking raids and later Norman invasions targeted these centers of native learning, while some texts, like the Irish Book of Leinster, miraculously survived. We know from references within them that they represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. Each lost poem was a window into a cultural sensibility that perceived heroism, nature, and the divine in ways profoundly different from the Latin-centered tradition of continental Europe. Their absence makes the medieval world seem more uniform than it truly was, as if everyone was reading the same book in the same language. The cumulative effect of these linguistic losses is a historical record that speaks in fewer accents. We are left with a tapestry where many of the most vibrant and contrasting threads have been pulled out, leaving behind a pattern that is simpler, quieter, and far less complete. To hear only the dominant languages of power is to miss the chorus that once filled the medieval world with its astonishing polyphonic song. Yet against this overwhelming tide of loss, a few precious threads of knowledge somehow survived. These stories of survival are not mere footnotes. They are essential counter-narratives that reveal the incredible resilience of the written word and explain the very sources of our partial understanding today. Manuscripts endured through a combination of sheer luck, human cunning, and the unpredictable nature of conflict itself. Sometimes, salvation came from being in the wrong place at the right time. A manuscript that was out on loan, being copied in a distant scriptorium, or carried by a traveling scholar at the moment its home library was destroyed, lived on. This geographical separation created accidental backups, scattering duplicates just widely enough that a single copy might escape a localized catastrophe. Other texts were deliberately hidden, sealed within the stone walls of monasteries or tucked away in desert caves by monks and librarians who saw the storm coming. These caches could remain forgotten for centuries, waiting for a later generation to rediscover them, often when the political or religious climate had shifted enough to allow their study. Perhaps the most ironic path to survival was through plunder itself. A literate soldier or a commander with an appreciation for art might loot a beautiful codex not for its binding, but for its contents, carrying it home as a personal trophy. This is how many Greek texts plundered from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade ended up in Italian libraries, eventually fueling the Renaissance. The book was a spoil of war, but its knowledge was not discarded. In some cases, the very act of censorship preserved a work. When a text was deemed heretical and ordered destroyed, a sympathetic official might hide it instead, or a rival institution might preserve it secretly as a reference for disputing the condemned ideas. The book survived not in glory but in the shadows, its very existence a quiet act of defiance against erasure. One of the most remarkable examples is the Archimedes Palimpsest. This manuscript contains the only known copies of several treatises by the ancient Greek mathematician, including his groundbreaking work on infinity and mechanics. In the 10th century, a scribe in Constantinople carefully copied Archimedes' words onto parchment. 200 years later, in a time of scarcity, a monk recycled the book. He scraped the ink from the pages, folded them, and wrote a prayer book over the original mathematical text. The work of Archimedes was literally buried beneath layers of liturgy. For centuries, it sat on a shelf, its true value invisible. It survived the sack of Constantinople because it was no longer recognizably a scientific treasure. It was a humble religious object. Only in the modern era, with advanced imaging technology, have scholars been able to recover the ghostly, underlying text, rescuing genius from oblivion through a combination of medieval reuse and 21st century science. Similarly, the flight of scholars often carried knowledge to safety. When the Mongols besieged Baghdad, some learned men, foreseeing the end, gathered what scrolls they could carry and fled west towards Syria, Egypt, or even as far as Spain. They took with them not just physical books, but the living knowledge in their minds, the interpretations, teaching methods, and unanswered questions that gave those texts meaning. This diaspora, while traumatic, planted seeds in new soil. A medical text saved in this way might form the core of a new library in Cairo, ensuring its ideas continue to circulate and evolve. These scattered, fragile survivors are the reason we know anything at all about the vast libraries that are gone. They are the lone data points from which historians must extrapolate an entire lost universe. Each surviving manuscript is a testament to 1,000 that did not make it, a single star by which we navigate a sea of darkness. They remind us that the story of these libraries is not one of total annihilation, but of a desperate patchwork salvage operation conducted across continents and centuries, often by individuals whose names we will never know. The survival of a single manuscript often hinged on a simple human act, the decision to make a copy. This quiet, repetitive work in scriptoriums across the world created the only backup system the medieval world would ever know. A library's true legacy was not measured by the treasures on its shelves, but by the number of duplicates it had sent out into the world before disaster struck. Libraries that functioned as active hubs for copying and distribution became what we might think of as seed libraries. Their primary purpose was not just to hold knowledge, but to propagate it. The earlier House of Wisdom in Baghdad is the ultimate example. Before its destruction, it wasn't a vault, it was a factory of replication. Scholars didn't just study texts there, they translated them into Arabic and Syriac, and scribes produced multiple copies. These copies then traveled along trade routes and scholarly networks to libraries in Cairo, Damascus, Toledo, and beyond. When the Mongols threw the originals into the Tigris, the knowledge was not wholly lost because its seeds had already been planted in distant soil. The same principle saved much of classical Latin literature. During the early Middle Ages, Irish and Anglo-Saxon monastic networks became unexpected seed libraries for Rome's legacy. Monks working in remote outposts like Iona or Bobbio meticulously copied the Latin texts that had made their way north. They weren't just preserving for their own use, they were part of an exchange, sending copies back to the continent or to other monasteries. So when Viking raids or local conflicts destroyed one monastic library, the texts often survived elsewhere in the network because a copy existed in a sister house hundreds of miles away. This distribution created a fragile but effective safety net. The contrasting fate, however, awaited libraries that were isolated or held unique, uncopied treasures. Consider the Royal Library of Buda. It was a glorious collection, but it was also a cul-de-sac. King Matthias built it rapidly by acquiring beautiful, finished codices from Italy. There's little evidence it operated as a major scriptorium pumping out copies for wider distribution. It was a magnificent endpoint, not a starting point. So when the Ottomans looted it, those specific, luxurious volumes were scattered. Since few, if any, identical copies existed in other European libraries, the texts they contained became instantly rarer, and some may have vanished entirely from the Western scholarly conversation for generations. This distinction between a hub and an endpoint explains the uneven survival we see today. We have multiple medieval copies of works by Cicero or Aristotle because they were textbook staples, endlessly copied in monastic schools across Europe. Their wide distribution guaranteed that no single fire could erase them, but we have only one fragile manuscript of the epic poem Beowulf, surviving in a single codex that was nearly destroyed in a library fire in the 18th century. It likely existed in other copies once, held in libraries that were themselves destroyed, leaving this one survivor as the last echo of a much larger tradition. The difference between a text that lives and one that dies forever often came down to a simple question: had a scribe somewhere taken the time to make a second copy and send it on a journey? The most secure library was never a single building, but the collective memory of a distributed network, a lesson written not in ink, but in the very pattern of how ideas were shared. The quest to rebuild these lost libraries has become one of history's greatest detective stories. Without the original books, scholars have turned to every possible clue, piecing together ghostly catalogues from the whispers left behind in other texts. One of their most vital tools is the ancient book list or pinax. These were essentially the library catalogues of the ancient world, etched on stone or written on scrolls to inventory a collection. By studying these lists, which sometimes survive even when the books they catalogue do not, researchers can reconstruct the scope of a lost library's holdings. For example, a pinax from a Greek library might list authors like Heraclitus or Sappho, confirming not only that their works were collected there, but how many volumes they occupied. These lists are like finding the detailed menu from a magnificent feast. Long after the food has been consumed, they tell us what was once on the table, even if we can no longer taste a single dish. Another method is to scour the surviving works of later authors for references and quotations. A medieval scholar in Spain, writing a commentary on Aristotle, might quote a passage from a Persian medical text he had access to in his own library. That quotation, preserved in his work, becomes a tiny, fossilized fragment of the original book that was later lost. By gathering thousands of these scattered citations from different sources, historians can sometimes reconstruct the rough outline and even key arguments of a vanished text, assembling a silhouette from a million scattered dots of ink. Beyond texts, the physical sites of libraries themselves are now being read like ancient code. Archaeologists carefully excavate the foundations of a monastery scriptorium or a palace archive, looking not for intact books, but for the environment that housed them. They analyze the layout of rooms designed for reading and copying, the niches where scrolls were stored, and even the chemical composition of the soil for traces of ink or parchment. A powerful example of this comes not from a medieval site, but from a Roman one that perfectly illustrates the method. The Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum was buried by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79. Its library was carbonized by the intense heat, turning hundreds of Greek philosophical scrolls into blocks of brittle, blackened material. For centuries, they were considered unreadable lumps of charcoal. Modern technology, however, has changed that. Using advanced techniques like multi-spectral imaging and even virtual unwrapping software, researchers are now able to digitally peer inside these carbonized blocks and detect the ghostly imprint of letters on the layers within. While the process is painstakingly slow, it has already recovered complete texts by the philosopher Philodemus that were unknown to the modern world. This work at Herculaneum provides a blueprint for hope, a demonstration that even the most seemingly destroyed library can still have its voices recovered, letter by microscopic letter. Today, this recovery mission has entered the digital realm. Ambitious projects in the digital humanities are attempting the virtual reassembly of scattered collections. Scholars are creating vast databases that link every known surviving manuscript fragment, book list entry, and textual reference to its place of origin. The goal is to create a digital map of knowledge flow, showing how a text written in Alexandria might have been copied in Baghdad, quoted in Cordoba, and eventually bound into a book in Budapest. By tracing these pathways, we can begin to understand the interconnected web that these libraries formed, a web that was torn apart by conflict. Some projects focus on a single lost library, like the Royal Library of Buda, digitally reuniting images of the Corvinus manuscripts that now sit in museums from Istanbul to Vienna, allowing them to be studied as a single collection for the first time in 500 years. Others take a broader view, aggregating data on every surviving medieval manuscript to model what has been lost by comparing the survival rates of texts from different periods and regions. This digital archaeology offers a new kind of resurrection. It cannot bring back the physical smell of parchment or the weight of a codex in a monk's hands, but it can reconstruct the intellectual architecture of a lost world. It allows us to walk through the ghostly halls of these libraries, not as empty ruins, but as spaces filled with the echoes of the conversations they once hosted. The work is a testament to a stubborn refusal to let silence have the final word, using the tools of our age to answer the fires of a past one. But even the most evocative stories must be questioned. The image of a river running black with ink is a powerful symbol of total erasure, yet it also serves as a cautionary tale about how history itself is written. Many of the most dramatic accounts we have of these library destructions come from chroniclers who were not neutral observers. They were often partisans, writing to glorify a victor, vilify an enemy, or convey a profound moral lesson about divine judgment or human folly. Their numbers were not meant as precise inventories, but as rhetorical tools. To say a library held 400,000 volumes was to declare its magnificence, not to provide a verified catalogue. To describe flames burning for months was to emphasize the totality of a cultural defeat. These exaggerations served a purpose, but they can obscure a more complex and often more tragic reality. The truth is that total, instantaneous annihilation was rare. More common was a layered process of loss that unfolded over days, years, or even centuries. Understanding this requires us to become detectives, learning to read between the lines of these ancient sources. We must ask, what did the chronicler witness personally, and what did they hear from others? Who was their intended audience, and what message were they trying to send? A Christian monk writing about the sack of a pagan temple had a different perspective than a Muslim historian documenting the fall of a rival city. Their accounts are not lies, but they are filtered through specific worldviews and literary conventions. The legendary black waters of the Tigris, for instance, likely symbolize a devastating and intentional act of cultural violence. But it is also possible that the reality involved a combination of deliberate burning, looting for valuable bindings, and the chaotic dumping of some texts into the waterway. The symbolic truth, the deliberate destruction of knowledge, remains powerful, but the physical event was probably messier and less poetically complete. This critical lens does not diminish the scale of the tragedy. Instead, it deepens it. It shifts our focus from a single, fiery moment to a slower, more insidious unraveling. A library might survive the initial siege, only to be picked apart in the aftermath. Soldiers might loot the jeweled covers and discard the pages. Local inhabitants in a shattered city struggling to survive might use priceless parchment to patch roofs or start cooking fires. A new ruling regime might systematically purge texts it found politically or religiously objectionable, while preserving those on, say, medicine or mathematics that had practical value. This selective destruction is in some ways more revealing than a blanket inferno. It shows a conqueror making conscious choices about what knowledge was permissible and what was too dangerous to allow to exist. The loss becomes not an act of mindless violence, but of calculated cultural editing. So when we read that every book in a library was destroyed, we should consider the fate of the people who lived there. Did every scholar perish? It is more likely that some fled, carrying a cherished volume or, just as importantly, the knowledge in their memory. A text might vanish from its home, but fragments of its ideas could live on in the teachings of a refugee scholar in a distant land, eventually being written down again in a new context. This process of dispersal means that the ideas themselves were sometimes more resilient than the physical objects that contained them. They migrated, mutated, and resurfaced in unexpected places, like intellectual seeds carried on the wind of conflict. Interrogating our sources in this way does not call the losses into question. It refines our understanding of how cultural memory actually fades. It was rarely a simple on-off switch, but a dimmer, slowly turned down through a combination of violence, neglect, repurposing, and selective preservation. The Black River is a potent metaphor for that darkness, but the real story flows through quieter, forgotten channels where knowledge slowly seeped away, drop by precious drop, until the well was finally dry. While grand libraries burned, a quieter, more pervasive form of memory was also being erased. The destruction of archives and record offices created a different kind of silence, one that severed the legal and social identity of entire communities. These were not repositories of poetry or philosophy, but of practical memory, the mundane paperwork that held a society together. Within their strongrooms lay royal charters granting lands and privileges, deeds proving ownership of a farm passed down for generations, meticulous tax rolls, and court records detailing disputes over a stolen pig or a contested millstream. This was the administrative DNA of a kingdom, the written proof of who owned what, who owed whom, and how justice was meant to function. When these archives were targeted, the result was not just a loss for scholars, but a paralysis that could cripple a nation and erase the history of its most ordinary citizens from the official record. The burning of a single archive could plunge a region into decades of legal confusion and social strife, as the foundational documents of order and identity turned to ash. The Savoy Palace in London stood as a symbol of this fragile system. It was the luxurious home of John of Gaunt, the most powerful and unpopular noble in 14th century England. More importantly, it housed his extensive administrative archives, the records governing his vast estates and the lives of thousands of tenants. In June of 1381, during the explosive peasants' revolt, a furious crowd targeted the palace. They did not simply loot it, their actions were meticulously destructive. They smashed furniture and threw valuables into the Thames, but they saved a special fate for the documents. Historical accounts describe the rebels hauling chests of charters, court rolls, and legal papers into the street and setting them ablaze. They understood perfectly that these parchments were the instruments of their oppression, the physical proof of feudal obligations, rents, and serfdom. By burning the archives, they were attempting to burn away their own legal and social bonds, to create a tabula rasa where old claims of lordship could no longer be enforced. The immediate effect was profound administrative chaos. Without these records proving who held which tenancy, who owed what service, or even the boundaries of estates became a matter of conflicting memory and opportunistic claim. The destruction created a legal vacuum that took years to partially reconstruct through painstaking inquests and sworn testimonies, a process that inevitably favored those with power and good lawyers. The revolt was crushed, but the act of burning those records was a powerful declaration that written memory itself was a form of power, and one that could be violently contested. Centuries later, a far more systematic assault on archival memory would unfold during the French Revolution. As the old regime collapsed, revolutionaries targeted the physical symbols of feudal privilege, and this included the mountains of paperwork that enforced it. In a deliberate campaign known for its symbolic fervor, crowds and officials stormed chateaus, monasteries, and government offices. They emptied archives onto public squares and lit bonfires of seigneurial records, titles of nobility, and tax documents associated with the monarchy. This was not mindless vandalism, it was ideological erasure. The goal was to incinerate the legal foundation of the ancient regime, to destroy the paper trail of hereditary privilege and create a new society born from the flames. While some state archives were preserved by officials who recognized their historical value, the loss at the local level was catastrophic. Parish registers, manorial court rolls, and centuries of property deeds went up in smoke. The effect was a deep rupture in social continuity, suddenly proving lineage for inheritance, establishing property boundaries, or tracing family history became extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. The revolutionaries sought to destroy the past to build the future, but in doing so, they inadvertently destroyed the mundane memories of countless ordinary lives, the very proof of their existence and their place in the world. This created a historical black hole for genealogists and social historians, a silence where there should have been a murmur of daily life. The loss of these civic and state archives represents a theft of social history. When a library of philosophy burns, we lose the thoughts of the elite. When an archive burns, we lose the footprint of the common person. Those tax rolls named every household head in a village, recording their wealth and giving us a snapshot of medieval economics. Court rolls detailed disputes that never made it into chronicles, revealing the social tensions, gender dynamics, and everyday concerns of people far from the throne. Parish registers of births, marriages, and deaths are the bedrock of demographic history, telling us how long people lived, how large families were, and how communities endured plagues and famines. Their destruction means that for certain places and times the population becomes a faceless mass. We know a battle happened nearby, but we cannot trace which local families lost sons. We know a famine struck, but we cannot measure its precise toll on a specific village. The people become statistical ghosts. This erasure creates a historical landscape dominated by the voices of the powerful, who had the means to have their deeds recorded in multiple, more durable ways. The quiet, cumulative story of community, written on fragile parchment in a local record office, was far more vulnerable. Its loss tilts our understanding of the past, making it seem as though history was made only in palaces and on battlefields, when in truth it was also made in fields, market squares, and courtrooms whose records are now just a memory of smoke. The loss of a library echoes far longer than the final ember cools. Beyond the physical annihilation of parchment and ink lies a deeper wound, a cultural trauma that reshapes how a society remembers itself and fears for its future. When a repository of ancestral wisdom is violently erased, it does not simply create a gap in the historical record. It creates a rupture in the very continuity of a culture, a break in the chain that links one generation's understanding to the next. This severing leaves a haunting void, a space where certainty turns to mystery, and where the foundations of identity can feel suddenly unstable. For communities that experienced such losses, the event often crystallized into a defining memory of catastrophe, a before and after moment that colored all subsequent history. The vanished library became a symbol of a stolen inheritance, a tangible proof of what was taken, fueling narratives of a lost golden age that grew more luminous and perfect with each retelling. These stories were not mere nostalgia. They were powerful psychological anchors, offering a sense of stolen dignity and a unifying grievance that could be woven into the fabric of a resurgent national or religious identity centuries later. The myth of a glorious past, preserved in books now turned to ash, became a potent tool for mobilizing cultural revival and at times for justifying new conflicts. This deep-seated fear of annihilation, of having one's memory erased from the earth, instilled a pervasive anxiety that influenced preservation efforts for generations. After witnessing such destruction, the act of copying a text transformed from scholarly duty into an act of cultural defiance. Each new manuscript produced was a vote against oblivion, a small stitch trying to mend a great tear in the fabric of time. This mindset helps us understand the medieval reverence for books not merely as information, but as sacred vessels. In a world where the written word was rare and painstakingly created, books were often seen as repositories of something far greater than human knowledge. They were conduits of divine wisdom, direct links to the mind of God as revealed in Scripture. They were the voices of the ancestors, the legal testimony of founding kings, and the collective memory of the saints. A library was therefore a holy site, a reliquary for the soul of a people. To destroy it was not just an act of war, it was a form of sacrilege, an attack on the spiritual and intellectual lineage that gave a community its purpose and place in the cosmos. This explains the profound shock recorded by chroniclers when libraries fell. The trauma was theological as much as it was academic. The loss created a spiritual disorientation, a feeling that the compass pointing to truth had been shattered. This historical rupture has lasting consequences for how we, even today, access the past. The gaps left by these fires force historians to reconstruct narratives from fragments, making our understanding of certain eras inherently speculative. It grants disproportionate influence to the sources that survived, often the records of the powerful and the victorious, while silencing the nuanced, alternative perspectives that those lost libraries might have held. We are left navigating history with a map full of blank spaces, forever wondering about the landscapes that once filled them. The legacy of this trauma is a double-edged sword. It fuels a relentless drive to preserve what remains, leading to the magnificent archives and digital repositories of our age. Yet it also carries the shadow of that old fear, a reminder of how fragile our collective memory truly is, and how quickly the light of understanding can be returned to darkness. The blackened pages and scattered bindings tell only part of the story. To understand the true impact of these losses, we must ask a difficult question: did the people of the time even care? The answer is not simple, and it reveals a medieval world with a far more complex relationship to books than our modern reverence might suggest. We find profound, heartfelt lamentation from those who understood what was vanishing. The Persian scholar Ibn al-Kifti, writing decades after the Mongol sack of Baghdad, described the House of Wisdom's destruction with palpable grief. He recounted how the precious books were thrown into the Tigris to form a bridge for the army, a bridge of knowledge trampled by hooves. His writing is not a dry historical note. It is a cry of loss from a man who saw himself as part of that broken lineage. Similar echoes of despair ring from Byzantine chroniclers describing the looting of Constantinople, and from Irish monks recording the desecration of their scriptoriums. For these individuals, a library was not a building, it was the soul of their civilization, and its loss was a spiritual and intellectual amputation. Their sorrow was specific and deeply felt. Yet in the very same conflicts we find a starkly different reaction, one of celebration or utter indifference. When the Serapeum library in Alexandria was destroyed, some Christian leaders saw it not as a tragedy, but as a righteous victory over pagan idolatry. The texts burned were not wisdom but dangerous heresy, and their destruction was a necessary purification of the city. This pattern repeated for centuries. During the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, texts of the Cathar faith were systematically sought out and burned. The act was a public spectacle of orthodoxy triumphing over error. For the soldiers and authorities carrying out these orders, they were erasing not knowledge but spiritual poison. The intellectual content was irrelevant, even dangerous. In other instances, the value of a book was purely material. To a Viking raider, a beautifully illuminated gospel was a chest of gold and jewels waiting to be pried from its cover. The pages inside were worthless kindling or scrap. To a soldier looting Buda or Constantinople, a heavy codex was a cumbersome object unless its binding could be melted down for bullion. The parchment itself was a valuable commodity, better used for patching a jerkin or wrapping supplies than preserving strange symbols. In the immediate, brutal economy of survival and plunder, a library was a warehouse of resources, not a temple of ideas. This complicated reality challenges our romantic view of the past. We imagine a universal reverence for the written word, but medieval society was not a monolith. For the literate elite, the clergy, and the scholars, books were sacred vessels of truth. For the conquering general, the common soldier, or the zealous reformer, they could be weapons, fuel, or currency. The same object could be a priceless treasure to one person and worthless clutter to another, all within the same sacked city. This duality lies at the heart of the tragedy. The destruction was so complete precisely because not everyone present valued what was being destroyed. The lamentations of a scholar like Ibn al-Kifti were voices in a storm, often drowned out by the cheers of victory or the silent, practical repurposing of parchment for daily needs. This forces us to see these events not through a single lens of cultural vandalism, but through the fractured perspective of the time where faith, greed, and survival could blind even a conqueror to the true nature of his spoils. The loss becomes more haunting when we realize it was not always recognized as a loss by those who caused it. Perhaps the most unsettling loss is the one we cannot measure, the books we do not even know are missing. Our historical record is filled with ghostly references and abrupt silences that hint at entire worlds of thought that vanished before they could be copied. We can mourn Sappho's lost poems because ancient critics tell us she was brilliant, but what of the genius whose name was never recorded elsewhere, whose single, groundbreaking manuscript turned to ash in a library that was itself forgotten? The true scale of the catastrophe is that it erased not only known masterpieces, but also the very possibility of certain questions being asked. Consider the sudden dead ends. In the ancient world, a vibrant tradition of mechanical engineering produced astonishing devices, like the Antikythera mechanism, a complex bronze analog computer for predicting astronomical positions. This one surviving artifact proves a sophistication we never attributed to that era. How many technical manuals detailing the principles behind such machines existed in the libraries of Alexandria or Pergamon? Their loss means an entire branch of ancient robotics and precise gearing simply disappears from history, leaving us to wonder what other inventions we have mistakenly labeled as medieval or Renaissance breakthroughs. Similarly, we have fragments of pre-Socratic philosophers who pondered the nature of atoms and the cosmos. Their ideas were radical and diverse. How many other schools of materialist or naturalist philosophy flourished, only to have every single copy of their teachings consumed in a fire set during a petty war? Their absence shapes our entire narrative of Western thought, making it seem more linear and inevitable than it truly was. The silence extends to literature. We know the great epics, but what of the novels? Ancient Greek and Roman authors wrote lengthy, imaginative prose narratives, romantic adventures, and satires. Only a handful survive. The rest are gone, taking with them our understanding of how everyday people told stories of love, adventure, and social critique. An entire popular genre, the equivalent of our films or streaming series, has been largely erased, leaving us with a distorted view of ancient entertainment as solely consisting of tragedy, epic, and history. This creates the greatest mystery of all, the unknown unknowns. We can list the authors we know are missing. We cannot list the ones we have never heard of. A chronicler in 9th century Cordoba might casually mention a brilliant physician from a distant city, citing her revolutionary work on anatomy. If that one citation is all that survives of her life's work, and the library holding her manuscripts is later destroyed. She vanishes from history twice, first her books, then even the memory of her name in the footnotes. The loss is not just of content but of direction. A scientific or philosophical tradition is a conversation. One text poses a problem, the next offers a solution, a third refines it. When a key volume in that chain is destroyed, the conversation stops cold. Later scholars, lacking that foundational text, might misinterpret the remaining works or abandon that line of inquiry entirely, thinking it a dead end. What we perceive as a natural stopping point in history, a field of study that simply petered out, might actually be the site of a library fire 1,000 miles away. The gaps in our record are not empty spaces, they are tombs for entire lineages of thought. We walk through the museum of history admiring the statues that remain, unaware that the most revolutionary pieces were stolen long before the museum was ever built. The haunting truth is this: we will never know what we lost. We can only sense the void by the strange shape of the knowledge that survived, like seeing the silhouette of a missing book on a shelf crowded with others. That empty space is the echo of a question that will now never be answered, a story that will never be told, a bridge to a different intellectual future that was burned before we even knew it was there. These scattered stories of ash and ink are not random tragedies. A clear, chilling pattern emerges from the flames, revealing why certain libraries were doomed while others endured. The first and most powerful factor was symbolism. A great library was never just a building. It was the ultimate emblem of a civilization's confidence, a declaration that its ideas were worth preserving for eternity. This made it a prime target for any conqueror seeking not just land but total victory. To sack a capital city was one thing. To burn its library was to attack the very source of its cultural authority, to publicly humiliate its intellectual legacy. The House of Wisdom was not an accidental casualty in the fall of Baghdad. It was the crown jewel of Abbasid prestige, and its destruction was a deliberate message from the Mongols, a demonstration that the old order was not just defeated but erased. Similarly, the Imperial Library of Constantinople represented a 1,000-year claim to be the rightful heir of Rome. When Crusaders looted it in 1204, they were not merely plundering wealth. They were dismantling a symbol of Byzantine superiority that had intimidated the West for centuries. The library's collections were the physical proof of that claim, and scattering them was an act of symbolic leveling. Closely tied to this was the peril of location. Grand libraries were almost always anchored in the nerve centers of power. They flourished in capital cities, within royal palaces, adjacent to great cathedrals, or at the heart of major monastic complexes. These were the very places most coveted by invaders and most fiercely contested during any siege or revolt. A library's prestige placed it in the crosshairs of every conflict. The Royal Library of Buda was inseparable from the palace of King Matthias. When the Ottomans broke through at Mohocs, the palace and its treasures were the ultimate prize. The library's fate was sealed the moment the city's defenses fell, not because the Ottomans hated knowledge, but because they were systematically claiming the spoils of a royal capital. This geographical vulnerability created a cruel paradox. To be influential, a library needed to be at the center of things, but to be at the center was to stand on the most dangerous ground whenever the world turned violent. Beyond symbolism and location, we see the brutal calculus of material value. In the immediate aftermath of a battle, the contents of a library were often assessed with cold, practical eyes. To a soldier, a jeweled gospel cover was a lump of gold. The sturdy parchment of a philosophical treatise was valuable scrap leather, perfect for repairing a boot or a saddle. The metal clasps and fittings were raw materials to be melted down. This utilitarian perspective led to what we might call creative destruction. Books were not always burned outright. They were disassembled. Their components were fed into the everyday economy of survival and plunder. a process that fragmented knowledge just as completely as any fire. The widespread scraping and reuse of parchment in medieval Europe, often for binding new books or wrapping goods, is a quiet testament to this. A work of history or poetry might end its life as the stiffening inside the cover of a merchant's ledger, its original text forever hidden beneath glue and new leather. This form of loss was not ideological. It was economic, and in some ways that made it even more thorough. It treated the book not as a vessel of ideas to be contested, but as a simple object to be consumed. Yet the most profound driver of destruction was neither loot nor location, but the desire to unmake a rival's memory. This is where conflict moves beyond the physical into the realm of identity. When a new religious or political order sought to establish itself, the texts of the old order became dangerous. They preserved alternative ways of seeing the world, competing truths that could challenge the emerging narrative. Their existence was a threat, so they were sought out and destroyed not for what they were made of, but for what they contained. The burning of pagan texts in Alexandria, the systematic destruction of Cathar manuscripts in France, and the targeted erasure of Armenian cultural records all follow this pattern. It was a form of cultural editing, an attempt to rewrite history by ensuring only one version of the story survived. The conquerors understood that to control the future, you must first control the past. And the past lived in the library. By setting it ablaze, they aimed to create a silence so complete that future generations would have no written evidence that any other way of thinking had ever existed. This ideological erasure is the darkest thread in our pattern, for it confesses the true power of the written word. It is not just a record, it is a weapon, and in the wrong hands, a target. When we step back, these four factors — symbolism, vulnerable location, material reuse, and ideological erasure — intertwine to explain the map of our losses. They show us that the destruction of a library was rarely an accident of war. It was often a deliberate, multifaceted act. A conquering army might be drawn to the capital for strategic reasons, target the library as a symbol of the old regime, loot its treasures for immediate gain, and burn its core texts to prevent ideological resistance. Each layer of motivation compounded the finality of the loss. This pattern also reveals the libraries that had the best chance of survival. They were often the humbler ones, located in more remote monasteries, or those whose contents were so widely copied and distributed that no single fire could erase them. The most secure library was not the grandest trophy in the capital, but the idea that had been seeded in 1,000 different minds and 100 different scriptoriums, far from the center of power. In the end, the pattern teaches us a sobering lesson about civilization itself. The places where we gather our greatest thoughts are, by their very nature, among our most fragile creations. They shine brightly, and that light attracts both pilgrims and destroyers. To build a library is an act of profound hope. To burn one is an admission that some ideas are too powerful to be left standing. The memory of those fires now burns in the very protocols designed to prevent them. The legacy of medieval loss is not only a scar on history, it is the foundational reason for modern library preservation. Today's librarians and archivists are the direct heirs to that centuries-long struggle, and their work is guided by the hard-learned lessons of vanished collections. Their mission is no longer just to collect knowledge, but to engineer its survival against every conceivable threat. This shift from passive storage to active, strategic defense is the living response to the tragedies we have witnessed. It begins with a simple, powerful principle born from the ashes of Baghdad and Constantinople: redundancy. The medieval world learned too late that a single, glorious manuscript in one place was a treasure waiting to be lost. Our world now operates on the opposite logic. The core ethic of modern preservation is to never let a unique idea exist in only one form. This is achieved through systematic duplication. Major libraries and archives create high-resolution digital surrogates of their most fragile and important items, but the work does not stop at a scan on a server. Those digital files are then copied and stored in multiple, geographically dispersed locations, secure data centers sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles apart. A catastrophic event in one city, whether a natural disaster or a human conflict, cannot erase the record because an identical copy exists safely elsewhere. This global, distributed network of memory is the ultimate answer to the vulnerability of the singular, symbolic library. It ensures that no river, no matter how black with ink, can ever again be the only resting place for a civilization's thoughts. This practice transforms preservation from a local duty into a shared, international responsibility, a collective vow that the silences of the past will not be repeated. This global commitment is formally enshrined in international law, most notably in the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. First adopted in 1954, directly in the wake of the widespread cultural destruction of the Second World War, this treaty is a landmark. For the first time in history, nations agreed that cultural heritage, including libraries, archives, and museums, must be shielded from the ravages of war. The convention establishes that these places are not legitimate military targets. It creates the now familiar blue and white shield emblem that can be displayed on cultural sites to identify them for protection. Perhaps most importantly, it frames the defense of cultural property as a matter of international concern, vital to all humanity. This legal framework represents a profound evolution in thinking. It acknowledges that the burning of a library is not just a loss for one nation, but a theft from the shared inheritance of our entire species. The convention turns the medieval conqueror's calculus on its head. Where once the destruction of a rival's memory was a tactic of war, it is now a war crime. This does not make libraries safe, as conflicts around the world tragically continue to show, but it creates a tool for accountability and a standard for civilized behavior. It makes every soldier and commander potentially liable for the cultural vandalism that was once a routine part of conquest. This legal shield is the culmination of a long, painful education, a global promise written in direct response to the echoes of all the libraries that came before. On the front lines of this promise are modern professionals who see themselves as guardians in an unbroken line. When a curator in a climate-controlled vault carefully unboxes a medieval manuscript for digitization, they are performing the same essential act as a monk in a scriptorium, but with tools the monk could never have dreamed of. Their work, however, is now guided by a proactive, scientific understanding of threats. They combat not just fire and sword, but the slow, invisible enemies that claimed so many texts: acidity in paper, fluctuating humidity, light damage, and biological pests like bookworms and mold. Preservation science has become a sophisticated field, using chemical treatments, specialized housing, and precise environmental controls to slow decay to a near standstill. In active war zones, this mission takes on a heroic, urgent dimension. Archivists and librarians in conflict areas often perform their most vital work as a crisis unfolds, racing against time to box and move collections to basements or secret locations. International organizations now train them in emergency heritage response, teaching techniques for stabilizing damaged materials and documenting losses for future restitution claims. These individuals are not neutral bureaucrats. They are activists for memory, often working at great personal risk because they believe, as their medieval predecessors did, that to lose these texts is to lose a part of their people's soul. Their courage directly honors the legacy of those who failed to save the libraries of the past by refusing to let history repeat its most devastating silences. The most transformative tool in this new arsenal is digitization. but its goal is profoundly ancient: to create perfect, immortal copies. A high-resolution digital scan of a 1,000-year-old manuscript does more than preserve its content, it liberates it. That digital file can be studied simultaneously by scholars in a dozen countries, removing the physical fragility of the original from the equation of access. It can be analyzed with software to reveal faded ink or layers of text, much like the work on the Archimedes Palimpsest. Yet the digital realm introduces its own novel perils, what experts call the digital dark age. File formats become obsolete, storage media degrades, and the very systems we create can become unreadable to future generations. The response, again, is medieval in spirit but futuristic in execution: constant migration and redundant storage. Digital preservationists ensure files are regularly moved to new formats and fresh storage media, a never-ending cycle of copying that is the direct descendant of the monastic scriptorium's labor. The cloud is not a single place, it is a distributed network, a virtual version of scattering copies to 100 different monasteries for safekeeping. This ongoing, global project is the modern world's answer to the central tragedy of our story, the vulnerability of the last copy. It seeks to ensure that no idea, no matter how old or obscure, will ever again face extinction because it existed in only one fragile, physical form. The work is never finished, just as the copying in a medieval scriptorium was never truly done. It is a perpetual vow, a promise to the past made by the present, to carry the light forward so that it may never be lost to the darkness again. The true cost of these fires cannot be measured in volumes alone. Our journey has shown that the destruction was never a single act, but a layered and cumulative process. It was the swift violence of the siege, the slow decay of neglect, the cold repurposing of parchment into patchwork, and the deliberate ideological erasure of competing truths. Each library that fell created a ripple of silence, but together they formed a cultural catastrophe that reshaped the landscape of human thought. We can, with effort, list the known losses: the missing books of Livy, the songs of Sappho, the scientific manuals of al-Razi. We can point to the empty spaces on the historical shelf where entire civilizations once kept their records. Yet the deepest wound is the one we can never fully catalogue: the unquantifiable void. This is the loss of the alternate intellectual paths that were closed off forever, the conversations that ended mid-sentence, the questions that, once forgotten, were never asked again. It is the haunting possibility of a different human trajectory, one where a preserved idea from Alexandria or Baghdad might have illuminated a dark age centuries earlier, or where a unique philosophy from Nalanda might have offered the world a different way to reason. The void is not just missing information, it is missing potential. It is the chilling realization that our understanding of history, philosophy, and even ourselves is built upon a foundation that is full of silent, empty chambers. We are left navigating by the light of the fragments that survived, always wondering about the constellations we can no longer see. This legacy teaches us a humbling lesson about the profound fragility of knowledge. For most of human history, our greatest ideas existed in a handful of unique, vulnerable objects, concentrated in places that were magnets for both reverence and conflict. A single spark, a decision by one soldier, or the shifting winds of political doctrine could erase in a moment what had taken centuries to build. That fragility did not end with the medieval world. It simply changed form. Today, our collective memory faces new threats, from digital obsolescence to the ongoing destruction of archives in modern conflict zones. The call to action, then, is clear. The work of preservation is not a niche academic hobby. It is the ongoing defense of our shared human story against the persistent risk of forgetting. We can all play a part. We can support the libraries, museums, and digital archives in our own communities. we can advocate for the protection of cultural heritage as a global priority. And we can cultivate a personal appreciation for the miracle of preservation itself, for the chain of hands and minds that passed a fragile text from one generation to the next against all odds. Every time we open a book, access a digital manuscript, or walk into a quiet library, we are stepping into a space that has been fought for. We are beneficiaries of a long, quiet war against oblivion. The next chapter of this story is ours to write, not with ink on parchment, but with the choices we make to safeguard the light we have inherited, ensuring that no more voices are added to the vast and echoing silence of the past. But the story of these libraries does not end in the ashes. It lives on in the quiet, determined work of uncovering what remains and protecting what we still have. This channel is dedicated to that very pursuit, to bringing these hidden histories and forgotten stories back into the light. We explore the shadows of the past not to dwell on loss, but to understand the incredible resilience of human knowledge and the fragile threads that connect us to those who came before. If these journeys into our shared memory resonate with you, please help this channel grow. Liking this video tells YouTube you want more content like it. Subscribing ensures you never miss our next deep dive into a lost chapter of history. And turning on notifications means you will be the first to know when we uncover a new story. The quest to piece together our past is a collective one, and your support makes it possible. For those who wish to explore further, the description below is a gateway. You will find a list of sources and books that inform this script, offering paths for your own research. You will also discover links to remarkable organizations around the world that are on the front lines of preservation, from digitizing fragile manuscripts to protecting endangered archaeological sites. Supporting them, even by simply learning about their work, helps ensure that the next great library, wherever it may be, has a chance to endure for centuries to come. Thank you for watching and for joining this ongoing conversation with history.